Welcome to Education Connect by Knovva, the podcast that explores innovative teaching methods and success stories, newsworthy updates in education, and current trends in the classroom. Whether you're a veteran educator, an industry thought leader, or a parent navigating the academic landscape for your child, we've got you covered. And hey, we know all about the hectic schedules in academics, so we're all about delivering content that's relevant, concise, and actionable. So hit that subscribe button and let's learn better together. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Education Connect by Knovva, the podcast where we learn from experts, innovators, and leaders in the world of education. Each year, millions of students apply to college, which means that millions also sign up for standardized testing. The two tests sometimes necessary and almost always beneficial for the application are the SAT and ACT. However, as early as February 2024, both tests will be getting a digital makeover. I'm here with the founders of Ivy Method Tutors, Harvard alumni Peyton McDavitt and Michael Robin, to talk about these upcoming changes and how students can prepare for them. Peyton graduated from Harvard with an AB in the history of art and architecture, a citation in Spanish, and a love of teaching. She's an expert in standardized test prep and the college essay. She's helped advance students through applications into gifted programs, tutored English in Chile, and as a Harvard Varsity Club Hall of Famer, particularly enjoys mentoring young student athletes. Michael has worked in education for nearly 2 decades, guiding hundreds of students to success on standardized tests and the college process. After graduating from Harvard with honors, he launched his career as a high school English teacher in Teach for America, and was later one of 40 American teachers selected to pilot a summer school program for low-income children in the Middle East. He loves nerding out on grammar rules, teaching polynomial factoring, and helping young writers find their voice. Hi, Peyton and Michael. How are you today?
So great. Thank you so much for having us
Great.
on. We're very excited to be here.
Such a
Absolutely.
pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, thank you again. So there have been several significant changes to the SAT and ACT that are coming up in 2024, starting specifically with the digital format. However, we've had access to digital tests for years, so why the change now?
You're right. We have. I think the change really comes in the wake of COVID. COVID shut down testing completely. And so, first of all, the College Board wants to make sure that there's continuity of testing in the event of a future COVID-like event. They also want to stay relevant. They want to stay relevant. And this generation is so digitally inclined. I think they really wanted to find a way to make the SAT shorter as well. That was feedback I think they were getting a lot. So making it shorter, the digital format has given them a way to do that. And we will actually explain how in just a moment.
Fantastic.
But also this is about money. In recent years, like the College Board has changed the SAT every 8 to 10 years. And it's a way, this wasn't always the case. It was, for a long time, they didn't make changes. And then the last 2 decades, they've changed it a lot. And it's a way to seem relevant and to capture market share of test takers. The digital SAT helps them capture market share in what is a quote unquote test optional world. We'll get to why that isn't really true in a moment. But it's a way for them to sort of ensure that they're still getting people signing up for their exams. And it's important to know that in this transition for SAT, specifically, the paper SAT has been fully phased out. So there's no longer even an option for students to do that. There's only one SAT starting in March, and it's the digital exam.
Wow, good to know. Okay. I guess things are much different than how it was when I was taking the SATs.
Yeah,
they're very
10
different.
years ago.
Yeah, they're very, and relative to when we took the SAT, even more different. It's transformed a lot. Although some things left and have returned, which we'll get to.
Very good to know. So besides the digital format, what are some other changes students can expect on the SATs or ACTs if they're taking them?
Yeah. So to talk first about the ACT, and we'll sort of get into the digital ACT a little bit. There are no meaningful changes to the ACT paper versus the ACT digital. There are no meaningful changes to that digital exam. The digital ACT is basically a digital version of the paper ACT but worse, like much worse, like significantly worse. It's the same questions, the same format in terms of the organization of the sections, but it appears to have been designed very, very hastily. The ACT folks saw the SAT folks going digital and seemed to have hastily slapped together a digital version of the ACT to compete with the digital SAT. One of the biggest frustrations for us with the digital ACT piece is that, and we've actually been emailing, Peyton and I just got an email from the ACT folks this morning that was riddled with grammatical errors, trying to clarify. Yeah, I mean, like very obvious subject verb errors in this email from the ACT folks. We were asking them specifically about some of the design of the digital practice test as opposed to the real test. And there are the SAT folks, and we'll come to this, have done a pretty good job. Like I would say actually a very good job communicating the changes they've made and how the digital practice test is designed and will function, and giving kids access to digital practice tests that are representative of the real exam.
Yeah.
The digital ACT is the exact opposite. The only digital ACT practice tests available on the ACT's website, we asked them and they said, well, this isn't exactly like the real test. It's more of a guideline. We can't show you what it's, the real test might be different from this. The practice digital ACT that exists on their website is missing some functionality from sections. The English section doesn't have a process of elimination answer tool. There's a lot of problems with the digital ACT. So to answer the question in the most succinct format in terms of digital ACT, it's like taking the paper ACT on a computer, but without any of the resources you have at your disposal to take a test on paper, like crossing off answer choices, making annotations. And we would recommend students avoid it at all costs. It's a very badly designed exam at the moment.
Yeah, I'm gonna avoid it. Michael, you're just giving me anxiety.
It stresses me out. It gets me I get very upset about this. I'm like, why are they doing this to our kids? It makes me sad.
Yeah, I know.
The paper ACT, which we'll come to, is an exam we recommend, and we're recommending a lot this year. The digital ACT, avoid at all costs.
That's really good information. It sounds like they've just made it a little bit worse, I guess.
Well, honestly, a lot bit worse.
Whereas the SAT, there have been a lot of changes. I'm going to start with a spoiler alert. Like, we are actually advising our students not to take the digital SAT this particular year. We're going to explain why in a moment. However, to reiterate what Michael said, it's very clear that the College Board has put a lot of thought and resources into designing this new test, and they have done they've done a great job making this very student friendly. And frankly, it's the best version of the SAT we've ever seen content wise, but we're still not recommending it this specific year for two reasons. And we're going to get to that in a moment. We hope that there's a version in the future that we want to recommend. Namely, the biggest changes really are the length changes. It's a shorter test. The old test was 3 hours, 145 minutes. The new SAT is 2 hours, 14 minutes, 98 questions. On average, students have more time for each question, which is great. Basically, there's a few major changes structurally. Length. The new SAT is a shorter test. The old SAT was 3 hours and had 154 questions. The new SAT is 2 hours, 14 minutes with 98 questions. On average, students will have more time to answer each question on the new SAT. Structure-wise, there used to be 3 sections. It was reading and writing were separate, and then math. And now there's 2 sections. Reading and writing are combined. Writing is basically grammar, and math. The last major change is that there's no essay at all.
Wow.
And there had been like this. Recently, they were phasing the essay out, and then now it's completely phased out. So, but the other big change, well, there's a few, but the most significant of these digital SAT changes is that the new SAT is modular adaptive. And what that means, this is a little confusing. It's not like the GRE, which changes every question. Instead, the new SAT is split into 2 separate modules, right? The first module is a combination, and this is, by the way, across each section, across each of those 2 sections for the math and then for the combined reading writing. The first module is a combination of easy, medium, and hard questions, basically a grab bag of all levels of difficulty. depending on how you perform on that first module, you will either be put into a harder version of module two or an easier version of module two. If you don't do well on that first module, you get the easy version of module two and you are locked out permanently of getting a top score on that section. So that's
Wow.
pretty significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the other big, sort of some of the other more nuanced changes, I should say, in reading and writing, there's some changes that we really like in terms of the structure of this section. Bigger changes here than in math. In the old SAT and still in the ACT, there would be a big long reading with a bunch of questions about that one reading. And now each question has a short reading with it, right? So instead of having 7 or 8 questions based on one reading, you have a short little paragraph and then a question based on that. In addition, the old exam questions, there would be questions of all different types sort of scattered throughout. Now the questions are grouped together by question type. So let's say you're doing sentence completions, they're all going to be together. You're not going to be jumping around between different types of questions. And then finally, I alluded to sentence completions. The most recent version of the SAT had gotten rid of sentence completions completely. They've returned. We like them,
Yeah.
we're vocabulary nerds, but it's the first time since 2016 students are going to have to start sort of brushing up on their vocab again.
Mhm.
So those are sort of the biggest content changes in reading and writing. Fewer in the math section. The biggest change with respect to math is that the old paper SAT that we've been coming off of had a no calculator math section, which was sort of more abstract. It was based around more algebra. That's been eliminated completely. You have a calculator on
Mhm.
every question for this test. And in fact, in addition to the graphing calculator, approved graphing calculator that you can bring to the test, like a TI-84, you can also use the built-in calculator that the test has, which is effectively a version of Desmos, which is like an online calculator system. And it's something that's worth getting comfortable
Mhm.
working with and using because Desmos, this calculator is actually quite powerful. Unlike,
Mhm.
we've already knocked the digital ACT, which is a very rudimentary calculator. The calculator on the digital SAT is actually pretty great. They will provide scrap paper on the math, so that's helpful because students need to be doing math on paper. But yeah, those are sort of the big um, internal section changes to the exam, the new digital exam.
Now, is there a place you recommend right now where students can get comfortable with the specific type of calculator that they're supplying on the?
Yeah, absolutely. Students will need to download the Blue Book app,
Okay.
which is the official app where they would take the test. That's actually where you take the digital PSAT and the digital SAT. And the app itself has great practice exams um, where the calculator exists, so you can learn it actually right in there.
Awesome. All right, perfect. Now, what are some advantages that you would think for the SAT or, potentially in the future ACT for going digital?
I think let's just talk about the SAT. SAT has some
Yeah.
advantages. First being that it's a shorter test. With the new test, because of the reading passage change, going from large passages to small passage per question, it's great because it only affects, if you don't understand a passage, it only affects one question, whereas in the past, if you were struggling with this particular passage, it would affect 7 or 8 questions.
Mhm.
Another great aspect is scores come back faster. And then last week, Michael and I are really a fan of this one. The word problems in the math section are significantly shorter. The old SAT was discovering that the longer word questions with excessive information was really putting multilingual learners at a disadvantage.
Mm.
So they've really streamlined those math word problems and seeing a great result there. As for the digital ACT, no, there's no advantages. Please don't take it. Take the paper.
Yeah.
Very
I think
good.
if there's one thing we've been very clear on today, it's
Yeah.
to avoid the digital ACT at all
Yeah.
costs. So,
Very true. Very true. If it's the one takeaway, that's the one. And then we just talked about advantages. So what are some potential disadvantages you're seeing with the digitization of
yeah.
these tests?
Yeah, and I think we've alluded to this already, and I think it's helpful to get into specifics. We are not recommending students take either digital test this year. So
Hmm.
we've been very clear, don't take the digital ACT, period. But we also don't think students should be taking the digital SAT this year either. We're recommending students take the paper ACT. And there's a couple of reasons. One of them is that just in general, transition years for these exams almost always have problems. The last
Hmm.
time there was a big transition, circa 2016, we saw this with our kids. I had a kid where, he went in and took this test, and the proctor was unfamiliar, and the information the proctor was given was not, it's unclear where the problem happened, but the proctor cut kids off like 5 or 7 minutes early on a
No, it's
section.
10. You told me this.
Was
It's
it
10.
was it 10 minutes? Yeah.
Yeah. It's
It
really
was
significant.
very early. It was significant. It was very significant. And
Hmm.
and the College Board acknowledged that there was a problem, but their solution was, well, you can retake it for free. The kids have
Oh
spent
no.
all this time and emotional
I
energy
know.
going into this exam. Like, it's not about the free, it's about they just got bad scores because of the College Board screw up, or the proctor screw up, or someone made a mistake somewhere in the process, and those types of things always happen in transition years. Um,
Mm.
and further, just any new exam, when you go in and take a new test that hasn't been implemented at scale yet, you are signing up to be the guinea pig for that test. And it's just never a good idea to put yourself in that position,
Mhm.
because things go wrong, especially with something like a digital exam where you have a lot of people accessing this one test on this one, the servers and whatever. There's possibilities for all kinds of problems at every level here. We just don't want kids to,
Mhm.
have to retake it or be in a position where they're not scoring as well because of things that are outside their control.
Right.
Um, so baseline this year, that is the biggest reason we're sort of like, take the paper ACT. Also, and in addition, and we think that this is pretty important, there's research that shows that students, perform better on analog exams over digital. There's a University of Tokyo study that said as much. And just, anecdotally from our experience, test taking strategy relies so much on tactile interaction with the exam.
Mhm.
So much of test taking strategy is about annotating the test. And these digital exams, it's very hard to do that and mark up the test in a way that is in a way that gives you that same interaction and sort of focus on what you're annotating. The digital ACT doesn't have annotation in it built into it at all, so you can't. So again, as we've already said, don't take that exam. But the digital SAT, which does have annotation built into it, it's just not as effective as annotating
Right.
and marking up the exam with a pencil. And in addition, when you're doing, for example, math on the digital SAT, you're going to do that on paper. You're not doing that on the computer screen. And jumping back and forth between paper and a computer screen requires, there's a mental load transition there. And there's a focus transition, and even something, especially for kids with things like ADD, where you're looking from paper
Yeah.
to paper to screen, numbers get mistranslated. You get things wrong, not because you can't do it, but because you're switching gears mentally.
Yeah, for sure. To continue on the disadvantages, honestly, I think the biggest disadvantage really is the adaptive quality. It feels inappropriate to the cognitive level that high school kids are at. Not only that, it puts students with test taking anxiety, which is a lot of students, puts them at a severe disadvantage. If you don't do well in that first module, like you can't right the ship. And you'll know, Michael and I have run several trials on this. So we've taken the test many, many times and, seen where the breaking points are. And once it's a much easier second module. And just what that does to your brain when you're in the middle of a high pressure exam is like, you already feel like you're behind, or it's all for naught. And at that point you can't get above a 600 on either the verbal or the math, if you get locked into the easier module second. So that's the biggest thing that we're, I think, not a fan of, is the adaptive quality just doesn't feel appropriate for the age. And then lastly, you would think that the digital aspect would help with access, but students still have to go to a testing center. You can't take it at home. You can take it on your own device. You can take the digital SAT on your own device. You cannot take the digital ACT on your own device, but you still have to go to the testing center. So it doesn't create any better access anyway.
Mhm. Great observations. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
definitely there's always going to be a balance between advantages and disadvantages, but it seems like
Yeah.
there's definitely some inflexibility there, like as you're saying
Hmm.
with accessibility, or perhaps even Michael, your comment about switching gears and focus could be really challenging.
Hmm.
Exactly.
So the test taking landscape has changed dramatically over the last few years, as you both have said. What are your insights on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Dramatically is a very good word for how much it's changed. It's changed more in even just the college admissions landscape has changed more in the past 5 years than the previous 20.
Yeah.
The test optional policies that were implemented during COVID were done because it was extremely difficult for students to take the test in a safe environment. But with that context now, in the rearview mirror, we're seeing a huge push back to testing. And the reality is, selective schools, they want this data point. I think Michael's going to talk in a moment about what test optional really means, but truly, like Dartmouth and Yale just both announced that they're returning to requiring scores. MIT and Georgetown already have reinstated standardized tests. So, Michael, why don't you actually explain a little bit about the reasoning behind this push to return to testing?
Yeah, I mean, there was research done by the president of Dartmouth, who's a cognitive scientist, and there was also some research done at Yale. Both schools found that this test optional policy was disadvantaging lower income students, and
Hmm.
and part of it was that admissions officers, they look at applications in context, right? They're not looking at every student without knowing, what school they're coming from, what environment they grew up in, what resources they had available to them. And so, they're looking at students with fewer resources and knowing that a student with fewer resources who's able to do, better than other students at their school on these tests, they're going to factor that in, right? They're trying to find candidates who, given their environment and background and life experience, are rising above and who will thrive at their schools, right?
Hmm.
They're also using these tests as sort of markers of college readiness because part of the other findings of this research is that these tests were very predictive of students' grades at Dartmouth and Yale and other selective schools, more so than frankly anything else that they found was that using these exams, they could figure out how a student was going to do and whether a student would succeed at their school. Um, and also just on a practical level, this isn't part of the research, but practically, kids are applying to more schools than they've ever applied to. There are more applications being submitted than have ever been submitted. And schools are flooded with applications, and they need effective ways of sorting through them, and the
Hmm.
tests provide a way, right? So that's just sort of one piece of this wider puzzle of where we think things are headed. Um,
Fantastic. Yeah. I mean, of course, it makes a lot of sense. And I'm surprised because I didn't realize this data point as well about disadvantaging certain students. But it makes a lot of sense because
Yeah.
it's hard to say every student will perform the same on a standardized test. However, it is a really
Hmm.
great marker, as you're saying, for performance.
Hmm. Yeah, that's actually been a surprising piece of data research that's come out over the past few years was the indication that it was actually hurting disadvantaged students even more.
Mm.
Um, so we're glad that it's not a perfect system, and obviously we love that the College Board in particular is constantly working on evolving and um, trying to level the playing field for better lack of a better expression. But that data point was really surprising to us as well. But we're glad to see that people are doing research into this, into um, what helps find students, really well qualified students, to go to great schools, students who will do well and graduate and thrive.
Absolutely. So taking the ACT or SAT is still a great way to stand out in college admissions, as we know, even if the school is saying that they are test optional. So what recommendations do you have for students who are maybe on the fence between should I take it, should I not take it? What would
Yeah.
you offer them?
in this current landscape, in this test optional landscape, it is true that there are some schools like the University of California system, they won't look at scores at all, and you couldn't submit scores to them even if you wanted to. So if those are the schools you're applying to, you don't need to test, right? But there are other schools that call themselves test optional where it doesn't necessarily, they're not necessarily test optional. For highly selective colleges, those with lower than 35% admit rates, these scores, as we've been alluding to, they really do matter, right? And if you want to be considered for admission to these schools, you need to test and you need to score in their middle 50% range, right? If you think about it in terms of other aspects of the college admissions process, theoretically, taking rigorous classes and getting good grades in them is optional, and doing extracurriculars is optional, and going above and beyond is optional. But
Hmm.
highly selective colleges expect you to do the optional things. That is, by definition, what makes them highly selective. And at this juncture, taking these exams is a optional thing that is
Hmm.
not so optional for highly selective colleges.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit, if you are planning on applying to selective colleges, plan to take the paper ACT first. If that's really not your thing and you've done a few diagnostics, digital SAT, don't take the paper, don't take the digital ACT. Create a study plan for yourself to ensure that you are really ready on exam day. Obviously, this is what we do, so we recommend working with a professional. We've seen the difference it can make. Um, we usually recommend students plan 4 to 9 months worth of prep to hit their target score. And that really varies tremendously based on their starting point and their level of commitment. And a lot of times students will take the exam a few times to get their ideal score. So often that first sitting is getting a lot of that anxiety out. So plan to take it a few times. And again, during this transition year, we're really encouraging students to take that paper ACT.
Can you offer any predictions on how standardized tests will fit into college admissions in the future?
Yeah, it's interesting, it may be counter to our business interests, but like we would love for there to be a test-free future where this wasn't part of the process. It's very stressful. It puts a lot of the burden of admissions sort of on kids to
Mhm.
make these choices in an environment where there's consistently imperfect and sometimes incorrect information being given to them. But that test-free future, I don't know if it's so likely anytime soon. As we're seeing, I mean, these decisions that Dartmouth and Yale have made, that's been in the last few weeks. That's very recent. And we
Mhm.
think that probably other highly selective colleges will follow suit and move back towards testing. Um, I mean, it remains to be seen, but two in a row in the last few weeks, I think probably other colleges will follow in line with that. Um, I think it's very likely we're going to see a major revision to the ACT in the next few years to compete with the SAT. Certainly, I think they're going to find a way to make their digital product better, but it's been a very long time since they've actually, I mean, since I started in this business almost 2 decades ago, I don't think the ACT really has barely changed at all, and the SAT has changed 3 or 4 times.
Mm.
So I think the ACT is due for a change. I think we'll probably see
Mhm.
that soon. The only wild card is I'm very curious to see what the University of California system does. And other people may, because there's such a big state system, people sometimes follow in their footsteps. I don't think it's likely they're going to return to SAT, ACT testing. It is possible, and I hope not, but it's possible they may introduce a proprietary exam of their own,
Mm.
which would just put more burden on students to prep for multiple different
Oh yeah.
exams. That was certainly the conversation during COVID that they might do this. It
Wow.
hasn't happened, fortunately. But yeah, I can't predict what they're going to do, and I'm very curious to see what they're going to do.
Very interesting. Yeah, that would be I mean, actually completely unexpected in my eyes. Imagine if there are different school district or school systems who now implement their own tests on top of the standardized testing. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it would not be ideal for students. And I mean,
Mhm.
as much as we're encouraging kids to take the paper ACT this year, we appreciate the work that the College Board put into making a student-friendly exam. And I
Mhm.
think everyone ideally in this process, our hope is that every part of this, everyone involved in the college admissions process on all of the sides is thinking about the kids first. Certainly
Right.
that's what we're thinking about. Um,
So now, my final question for both of you is, if a student is on the fence about whether they should take the digital SAT or let's say the paper ACT for the time being, what recommendations can you offer? This might be a bit of a reiteration, but just kind of as a closing statement, feel free to.
Yes, we hope we've hit this over the head. First of all, the standard paper SAT is no longer available. You cannot take the SAT on paper anymore. So definitely paper ACT, 100%. Um, and paper is always our preference over digital. There is, you know, like Michael said, in the future, we do hope there's a version of the SAT we want to recommend. But if a student actually qualifies for extra time, the ACT is absolutely the right test for them. The ACT is an easier test without the time constraint because the biggest challenge of the ACT is the time crunch. So removing that as a hurdle, students should just immediately take the paper ACT.
One interesting sort of complexity to the recommendation of paper ACT is that for students, for high achieving students, and this is for current students who are currently sophomores who will be juniors in the fall of 2024, there is the PSAT in the fall of junior year, as you know, is also the National Merit Scholarship qualifying test. And for students who will be taking that this fall as juniors, there may be merit in doing some prep for digital PSAT, or I should say there is merit in doing prep for the digital PSAT for the fall to see if they might be able to score high enough to be a semifinalist for national merit. So the one sort of caveat to our paper ACT all the way is for students who this summer prep for the digital PSAT in order to try and qualify for national merit. And for students applying to highly selective colleges, that is a thing you should do. If they're on a roll with their PSAT digital prep and it's going well and they feel comfortable with the test and they're scoring well on practice tests, then it doesn't hurt to keep going with the digital sort of SAT after the PSAT. For some students, it's beneficial to prep for the digital PSAT, and then maybe it's not their test, they jump over to ACT. But if a student is doing well with the digital format, in prepping for PSAT / the National Merit Scholarship qualifying test, all the same exam, might as well keep going.
Makes sense. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate both of your insights, Michael and Peyton. This was a wonderful interview. And for our listeners out there who, perhaps they know someone who's about to take the digital tests or maybe paper, who knows. Perhaps this will help them guide their students or, at least get a little bit more insight about what's changing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we're always here if students hear this and then suddenly, have a lot of questions, they can always reach out to us.
I'm sure they will.
Our website is, ivymethod So just, call us. We're super happy. Michael's mentioned this before. We're very student focused. Student comes first for us. So we want to make sure that families are making choices based on good information and have, no matter what, they have the resources to make the right choice for them. So we're always happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. Yeah. And, a big part of our mission is sort of parent education and making sure parents, again, of all means, have the knowledge and resources to make informed decisions. And frankly, funny thing for us to say, but we understand that test prep isn't always fun, and we make it as fun as we can make it. And, our tutors, and that's part of our brand, we have the most experienced tutors in the business. We hire folks that have, 10, 15 years of experience, professional educators, as opposed to 22-year-olds just out of college reading from a book. But we also acknowledge it's work and it's not always fun. And there's a way to be intentional about this process. And, our big belief is kids should do the least amount of work and prep possible to get the scores they need on these exams. And then go do other things.
Yeah, go be a kid.
We want kids to be able to be a kid. We want kids to be able to pursue passions that are more interesting anyway to college admissions officers. And that's very much how we approach test prep is we come up with a plan and we work the plan with the kid and give them just enough so that they can, nail the scores and then be done.
Mm, yeah. Don't stress too much.
Yeah, try to make it as painless as possible.
Yeah, as
Yeah.
painless as possible. And I think that honestly, in a lot of respects, sometimes it's the stress that gets in the way of the thing, and we're
Right.
here to take that away.
Right.
It's about having the right tools and walking into that test day feeling super confident and knowing whatever comes at you, you have a strategy, you have a toolkit, you have these things, we've taught or that, that students have learned ready to attack the exam. Including things like, we do a whole webinar on sort of test taking anxiety to just make
Yeah.
sure kids walk in with peak confidence.
That's fabulous. Well, both of you sound like wonderful, wonderful guides, let's say, for success in high school and beyond. So again, Ivy Method tutors, Peyton McDavitt and Michael Robin. So thank you again so much for your time.
Erin, thank you so much. It was a
Pleasure.
pleasure to be here today.
Of course.